IOTP exclusive, exposing the synthetic gold leasing scandal. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
Very important episode. You've been building up to this over quite some time, haven't you?
Indeed. We did a series of shows about gold back in 2018 about the RBA, and that created a lot of public interest. We haven't really touched on it in the last couple of years as we've moved on to other issues, but there has been a range of audience members who have come back to us and said, well, whatever happened to these, to the questions of the leasing arrangement in terms of the audit, in terms of getting Australia's gold back from the Bank of England back into Australia. And so a couple of points to make. First off is that from our shows that we did back in 2018, we did get a response from the RBA, and what they did was they created a web page about our gold holdings, and let's actually put that web page up on the screen. And so this is public information. So before there was no information, and we just had to go on the annual report. Then they put us some information, and they explained a range of issues in terms of gold leasing. But the interesting thing about this was that they said that this was confidential, that they were not going to tell the public who they were leasing, and then obviously that created and this was done on the basis of commercial confidentiality, and so this has obviously still caused some questions as to, well, who did indeed borrow the gold, the 11 tons. So Martin, so the purpose of today's show is to reveal who borrowed the gold. We will actually touch on maybe about where the gold is, because that's also an interesting question. And then what I will do is I will provide my hypothesis, and I'm happy for you to challenge me on my hypothesis as to why did this particular counterparty borrow the gold.
Right, and it's worth saying, I think, John, that a lot of this is deep analysis on your behalf, right? There's probably a little bit of speculation and a little bit of thinking about it around the edge, but at the heart of it, actually, a lot of the information has come from the Reserve Bank.
Indeed. So where I just want to sort of start is, so let's actually put our slide one on the screen. So this is coming from the RBA website, where they actually have a graph about their gold leasing activities. And what we can see is that in the early 2000s, there was most of our gold was leased, because we had about 80 tonnes since 1997. And then around about after the GFC, we stopped leasing altogether. And then from about 2016, we have got back up to the leasing, and in the last couple of financial years, it's back up at about 11 tonnes. And obviously, what we did in our last show it was our first show about the 11 missing tonnes. There was a theory out there about the Bank of England leasing the gold out of the Bank of England, melting it down, and selling that gold around the world. And so obviously, given the lack of transparency, there were some big questions that we were trying to explore. So this graph sort of reveals, and obviously the RBA openly admits that they do lease the gold. Now, let's go on to slide 2, because in terms of the willingness to tell the public who has borrowed the gold, but also in terms of what sort of specific terms about, because the lease contract is confidential as well. So here we have this from the RBA website, quote, "The commercial relationships the Reserve Bank has with participants in the gold market are confidential. The same is true of the commercial relationships used in managing other official reserve assets." So we're not supposed to know. The gold market is quite secretive. It's quite sensitive, and we're not supposed to know. But the interesting thing is that also on the RBA website, they gave us a bit of a clue. And so let's go to our next quote from the RBA website. It says, quote, "Any gold leasing by the Reserve Bank is fully collateralized by cash, either foreign currency or Australian dollars, or has the benefit of a government guarantee of the borrower's payment obligations to the RBA." So this is the criteria. This is what the counterparty has to fulfill. So it's not just any Joe Blow off the street. It's either someone with collateral that they can either, if they default in terms of their lease arrangements, they can either hand over cash Australian dollars or foreign currency, or they have a guarantee from a sovereign government who's willing to write a check. So now, the interesting thing about this quote, and I just want to bring this to your attention, Martin, is when I read this implies that the counterparty has taken delivery, because obviously there's a question of in terms of collateral and in terms of whether you default or not. So obviously, if you take a mortgage, for example, your collateral is obviously in terms of the your equity in the property. So this implies that a counterparty has provided some sort of collateral for the gold, and if the gold's not returned, there is a default. And what we're going to go into our next part is something which is quite contrary to this statement from the RBA's website.
Right. So just to be clear then, the question is, there are two questions, right? The first question is the leasing arrangement itself. Who was the counterparty to the leasing arrangement?
Yes.
Right. And then the second is the structure of the leasing arrangement, and did the gold get moved?
Yes.
Or not?
Yes.
And therefore the physical gold, where is that?
Yes.
Right.
Indeed.
And then what's overlaying both of those two things?
Indeed. Now, one thing I should say is that I've published a detailed article about 2,500-3,000 words on my website, adamseconomics.com. Let's actually put that link up on the screen for people to have a look at. But before we reveal the counterparty, let's actually go to this question of what happens to the gold when it's leased, because there was a very interesting interaction in Federal Parliament in February 2019 where questions about gold leasing were actually posed. And this was the chairman of the House Economics Committee, Tim Wilson, the member for Goldstein. And these questions were asked because certain members of our audience in 2018 reached out to the committee and said, well, you are going to ask, the RBA is coming up. How about you actually ask them some questions about gold? And so our shows prompted some of these questions. So let's actually bring this
power of IOTP, right?
Absolutely. Well, at that point it was walk the walk, but indeed
Yes.
the power of the alternative media
Absolutely.
to bring attention to some issues. So let's actually go to this interaction. 22nd of February 2019, Tim Wilson to the Deputy Governor Guy Dobell, quote, "We lease it out, but we don't lease gold in." Dr. Dobell, yes. Matt Keogh is a Labor MP. It doesn't actually move anywhere, does it? Dr. Dobell, no. That's the other thing. The other point I was going to make is that Josh Wilson, who's also a Labor MP, we are the lessor. Dr. Dobell, in those gold vaults, when people buy and sell, by and large, the gold never goes anywhere. It doesn't even necessarily get moved around too much, because every time you move gold, you can lose a bit of it. I mean, that literally, the gold dust. And then Matt Keogh says it weighs less. And Tim Wilson then says, how do you lose it when you move it? Dr. Dobell, little bits. Fragments, ounces, Tim Wilson asks. And the last part is, Dr. Dobell says, absolutely, minute fragments come off. However, the store of the gold has the obligation to make good to the owner of the gold. So the weight of our gold is always what we own. What I mean is that they minimize the number of times they move the gold. So remember, this is testimony to Federal Parliament from Guy Dobell, Deputy Governor of the RBA. It cannot be as crystal clear as what he has said. He says that
It doesn't move.
The gold does not move. So we have lent out the gold to someone. The gold has not moved, according to the RBA. Now, what I will say at this point is that for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to accept what the RBA told Parliament. But I should say is that at this point, in February of 2019, there had only been one audit in 20 years, and that was in 2013. And that on that occasion, the RBA was not given unfettered access to our gold holdings. The Bank of England had a tightly controlled process, and we were only allowed to see a fragment of our 80 tonnes. So I do have some serious questions as to how would the RBA know if the gold has moved or has not moved, and this is one of the key follow-up questions that was not asked. But let's just say Dr. Dobell is actually correct in his statement to Parliament that the gold does not move. So the question I have for you, Martin, is, 11 tons of gold. worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Someone has borrowed it, but hasn't taken possession of it, according to the RBA. What from your background in banking and your background in finance, what commercial logic would you say someone would have to borrow gold that does not move in a foreign vault?
Well, the only thing I'm thinking of, John, is if you actually have leased it, right? And you had a balance sheet, and on that balance sheet you needed to actually show a particular asset. Essentially, that would work. So maybe it's to do with making accounts look a particular way. Hypothesis?
Yes. Well, I mean that is what we think has actually happened.
Okay.
So I'm happy to reveal that the counterparty who borrowed the gold was Gold Corporation, aka the Perth Mint, which is owned by the Western Australian government, which obviously, and the Perth Mint has a government guarantee from the WA government, so it actually meets the criteria as set out by the RBA website about who the counterparty can be. It's either you put up the collateral or you have a government guarantee. The Perth Mint has that, but the what we can reveal is that after 2 years of trying to keep this secret, we have found out it is the Perth Mint. Now, the question obviously is that how do we know it's the Perth Mint?
Yep, good question. Yep.
Now, last year, after this interaction in federal parliament, there was a request by one of our audience members, an FOI request, Freedom of Information request, to the RBA for documents relating to the 2019 gold audit. Those documents were released on the RBA website in September of last year. So I've known about this for a little bit, but we haven't sort of delved into this particular topic. And there was a email interaction between two RBA employees that, to be honest, should have been redacted, but wasn't. And I suspect it was an oversight on the part of the RBA. But let's actually put this email up on the screen. So these are two. So obviously the public document doesn't have the names redacted, so we haven't redacted the names. So these are actual employees of the RBA, and it basically says so we have one employee emailing David Cook, and it says quote, you refer to effectively 357,000 ounces of gold, or 0.35 million ounces of gold certificates. I understand that the gold system record this information as gold certificates, but these are no longer applicable under ISDA. The 0.357 million ounces are actually gold bars on loan currently to Gold Corporation. So this is, in my view, the evidence. We perhaps would, to be definitive, we probably would want to see the actual signed lease agreement between the two parties. But given that the RBA has said that's confidential, I'm accepting that this email from the 5th of April 2019 is a factual statement between two RBA officials and saying that we have leased it to the Perth Mint.
So have you looked at the Gold Corporation's accounts? Is there anything in the accounts that would reflect this?
Yes. So I'm glad you asked that. Now, so the balance sheet of the of Gold Corporation, it does have a series of liabilities, and it has a particular category called precious metal borrowings interest bearing. So this is precious metals that they have borrowed, and the interest bearing is effectively the rental payment or the lease payment that they have to make.
They're paying it, yeah.
Exactly. Now, as of 30 June 2019, the Perth Mint had borrowed $1.2 billion worth of precious metals from someone. And obviously the annual report doesn't actually go into detail as to who. Now, what we know from the RBA's accounts and the annual report was that the 11 tonnes that they leased as of 30 June 2019 was about $708 million. So of the 1.2 billion, about $700 million was the RBA's gold. And that means there's about another $500 million which has been borrowed by Perth Mint. We don't know if it's gold, we don't know if it's silver, we don't know who the counterparty is, we don't know where that gold or silver technically is, whether the Perth Mint has it in their possession or whether it is from someone else. So obviously the question then becomes okay, so we now have confirmation via an RBA email that gold in the Bank of England, which the RBA has testified to Parliament does not move, has been borrowed by the Perth Mint. And obviously the question is, well, why?
Pretty serious question as well, because of course, presumably the Gold Corporation is a for-profit entity. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
So it's a commercial entity. It's trying to essentially, create profit for its shareholders, right?
Yeah. And obviously in this case, the shareholder is the WA government.
Right. 100% owned by.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is 100%.
I think that might be quite important.
Yes. So and to be clear, Gold Corporation effectively has two functions. It manufactures gold and silver products.
Yep.
But also it is a retailer.
Yep.
And so it buys and sells. It's a trader, both of the wholesale market on the global market, but also in terms of local retail selling, etc. So now, so obviously, why would they have done this? Now, so I do believe that this is a technique to supplement its holdings. So when the auditors at a certain point in the financial year or at the end of the financial year, they say, well, you need to own a certain amount of gold and silver, show us what you own. And obviously part of that portfolio of gold and silver that they have, some of it they physically own. It's their legal ownership. It's in their possession. Some of it has been borrowed and it is sitting in foreign vaults. Now the question is obviously why. So now,
sorry, just a question there. So what you're saying is that they will have some physical metals sitting in their vaults, right?
Yes.
But if they need to create a larger pool for their balance sheet purposes,
yes,
the leased ones can be stood alongside them to
Yes.
create effectively a larger total pool.
Yes.
And from an auditing perspective, whether it's leased or whether it's held, it's the same.
Indeed.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Now the question is, well, why? So now, we it is no secret. I mean, we have said that I'm involved in the bullion industry. Yeah. Now, what I've been doing in the industry is sort of dealing at a retail level in terms of buying and selling physical bars, physical coins. So that's all we do. Now, in the last couple of months, I wrote an article for my website, and we'll put this up on the screen. And the article is "Beware of Synthetic Gold and Silver Products." Now, there's a range of products which are being sold around the world, including in the Australian market, what I call synthetic gold and silver. And these are products where you don't have direct legal title. So it's not like that you say, Martin owns this specific bar or Martin owns this specific coin. You are led to believe you own gold or silver, or you have exposure to gold and silver, but technically you don't. What you effectively have bought is a promissory note from a counterparty. And so what are these synthetic products? So these are things like unallocated gold and silver accounts, pool allocated in terms of ETFs, in terms of futures contracts, and then even in terms of, I would say, in terms of cryptocurrencies. All of these sort of products that are out there, if you buy one of these things, you do not have a legal title to a specific bar and a specific coin, and that's why I call these products synthetic.
Yep.
Now, the key point is now the biggest issuer of these products in the Australian market is the Perth Mint. And they have their PM Gold Pass, which is listed on the ASX, and they have unallocated, pool allocated, etc. So part of their claim is that, particularly on this unallocated gold and silver, is we have a pile of working gold and working silver, so you can basically buy a share of this, and obviously if the price moves, well then you get the price exposure, but you don't actually technically have legal title to a specific bar or a specific coin. Now, if you want to if you ever want to cash out your unallocated, there's a process to do that, and there's a fee structure with that. If you want to convert your unallocated to a physical bar, there are some fees with that. And obviously the claim is that for the pool of unallocated that they have the requisite gold and silver in their possession. And so that is their commitment to the market. Now, obviously, this scandal that I think is here is that a lot of people and a lot of people who watch the show have put money, and sometimes and some of the people I've spoken to, we're talking 6 or 7 figures into these what I call synthetic products, on the proviso that there is a statement by the Perth Mint that we have the requisite gold and silver. So the question that our audience and those involved in these synthetic products they have to ask is, when they hear these claims of that these products are 100% backed by gold or 100% backed by silver, or whatever the case may be, is, well, what consists of this backing? Where's the location of this gold and silver? And how readily available is this gold and silver if there is a request for the gold and silver to be delivered?
Right. And is it fair to ask a question, is there a one-to-one relationship between all the contracts are out there and the underlying gold, right? Because that would be the assumption, presumably.
Yeah.
And I'm just worrying about this in the context of, the derivatives markets, where we know that there's a huge disparity between the underlying and all of the other sort of stuff that's built over the top. I mean, are we looking at something similar here, do you think?
Well, so what I would say is that we have the institutional market, we have the retail market, we have sophisticated investors, we have unsophisticated investors. My experience talking with like in terms of retail investors, both sophisticated and also in terms of unsophisticated, there's just a general expectation that if there was ever a call on to convert to physical, the Perth Mint would be able to handle that volume.
Right. So they're assuming it's a one-on-one. So when I'm a retail purchaser of one of these, I'm basically assuming that there is gold somewhere that's, or whatever the metal is, aligned to that agreement that I've got.
Yes.
Okay.
And so my concern with this discovery is a portion of the portfolio that the Perth Mint says that they have to back up these products is not of their own physical ownership. They've borrowed it. Yep. And even if you borrow it, according to the RBA, the Perth Mint physically does not have it. It is sitting in a foreign vault, which the Perth Mint, I'm assuming that they can't physically take possession of it because it is leased and it is owned by in terms of the RBA. So and so, since I've had some conversations with some of our audience about this, I mean, that has been a bit of a shock as to that's not what my understanding of the situation is. And as we go through the documentation, I mean, what I obviously try to say to people is, you've always said that gold and silver has risks. And there are risks, obviously, with gold and silver, like with any other investment. But I would say that there are additional risks when you go into a synthetic product where legal title is not clearly established, and so some of those risks are obviously, there's the risk of over issuance. Yep. So you sell more synthetic products than what you have the underlying physical, and obviously when we've talked about the derivatives market, I mean, there are claims out there in terms of the global silver market. There's 500 claims to every ounce of silver, so that suggests a large Ponzi scheme. Yep. You have the issue of convertibility risk. So if you have a claim and you want to convert it to a physical, can they actually meet that demand? And kind of like with fractional reserve banking, in normal conditions, when there's a steady flow of people asking for it, that should be okay. But when you get a flood of people, that if they don't have it all in their possession to convert, I mean, that can overwhelm the system, and that's obviously where institutions, and I'm not just singling out the Perth Mint, because I no doubt other corporations around the world are doing this. I mean, if there is a run, I mean that's when you can get situations where they do not deliver the actual physical metal, and in those situations, investors can be shortchanged.
Right, and of course, as you critically make the point, there's a difference between normal course when everything's fine,
yes,
compared with in a crisis where suddenly people might feel, well, I actually would like to get now my physical gold, right? And so everybody turned up the amp to 11 at the same time, and suddenly there's a huge demand, and some of it's leased, they can't deliver it.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And then obviously you have the risk around what I would call in terms of rehypothecation. Yeah. So you've got the same ounce of silver, and you've promised it to several different parties. And so obviously when everyone sort of comes to say, okay, you say this is my property, give it to me. Oh, but it's not yours. It's actually Martin's. Well, why did you sell me this contract? The point of me writing these articles, Martin, about beware of synthetic gold and silver, it was really to bring attention to some of these additional risks that are in the market, because I felt that some of the people I was talking to who had money in some of these products weren't fully across what are the differences between synthetic gold and silver versus the actual physical, because typically the financial spreads in the synthetic are lower. So particularly for people putting in significant amounts of money, it appears to be a cheaper option. But even though it is technically cheaper to buy in and out in a synthetic product like unallocated, etc., there are some additional complications with that. And obviously, as we go forward, I mean, since March, when QE to infinity was announced by the US Federal Reserve, we have seen a surge of demand for physical gold, for physical silver, and that's obviously creating already some shortages in the market, and I think those things are going to intensify. And obviously, when you have a counterparty that now, and I should say, from my understanding, these arrangements by the Perth Mint are perfectly legal. They have been documented on their balance sheet. The issue is that I don't think it's been properly communicated to their customers and to the market in terms of, well, part of when we say these products are fully backed, part of this gold is gold in a foreign vault, which the RBA has certified to Parliament that the gold does not move. Now if there is an issue with the RBA's testimony, well, we can happy to revisit that element of the conversation. But obviously, going forward, if there is a further shortage and a squeeze on physical demand for gold and silver, that could create issues for a whole host of counterparties. And I should say, so there's a weekly YouTube video podcast between Eric Sprott, who's a Canadian billionaire involved in gold and silver, and another guy called Craig Kempke, and they talked about a customer in Canada. This was a couple of weeks ago, who had some silver. He bought some silver, put it in one of the Canadian banks, had some silver certificates, went to go redeem those certificates, and they didn't have the silver. And he basically was given Canadian dollars instead. And the difference for that customer is that he was given Canadian dollars at the spot level, what the international price was, but there's a difference between the physical price and the paper price, and he was probably sort of caught short. He lost out at about $10 per ounce in terms of that. So obviously, there's a lot of people out there saying that if you don't hold it, you don't own it. And obviously, one of the sort of underlying philosophies behind that statement is that if you are entrusting a counterparty to either hold physical or synthetic, there are some risks, and in times of crises, those risks can actually be realised.
I guess if you've got, if the total exposure is 100, right, and you've got 30 or 40 leased, right?
Yes,
that's one scenario, and that's not very positive necessarily, but perhaps manageable. But if you've also got hypothecation, which means that they're actually using that same physical to support multiple contracts, so a multiplicity of contracts, that's even more concerning. Now, you're not, or are you saying that Perth Mint is actually hypothecating?
No, so I don't have the evidence for that. Right. I will say that there are institutions around the world who are engaged in that.
Right.
But what we're saying is in this case is we have evidence from the RBA that they have leased out gold to Perth Mint.
Yes.
They have told Parliament the gold does not move, and the question is, well, why? Given that their core business is manufacturing, and in terms of being a trader, a buyer and seller of gold. So the logical answer to me was, why would they borrow gold that does not move in a foreign vault? It is to supplement their balance sheet and their metal portfolio. Yeah. Because they promise the market that their products are 100% backed.
Right. Okay. So there's nothing illegal about it. It's all on the accounts.
Yes,
right?
yeah. So you can go on the balance sheet and it
Yeah.
says precious metal borrowing, interest bearing.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
one of the problems that I have found with people who are involved in the market, they won't go to for example, I mean, I've spoken to people involved with like Perth Mint customers, and one of the things that they won't do or haven't done is actually read the balance sheet. And the other thing is that, I mean, there's a lot of people in the market who heavily rely on the guarantee by the Western Australian government. But one of the things I say to people is, well, have you actually examined the robustness of that guarantee? Because in the last 10 years, the WA government has racked up huge sums of debt. And obviously there's just been a recent kerfuffle between the government and Clive Palmer over a mining project. And Palmer wanted to sue the government to the tune of $30 billion. And Premier McGowan in the last fortnight said that if Clive Palmer ever sued the WA government and was successful, and the government had to pay Palmer $30 billion, the state would be bankrupt. And obviously in that circumstance, those who are relying on this guarantee with the Perth Mint, I mean, yeah, if the Premier's saying, if Clive Palmer wins this legal action, we're bankrupt, that means that this guarantee with the Perth Mint is basically null and void. And so these are some of the elements that people should be delving into, but unfortunately I've noticed people just accept promises on face value without digging in. And I think the purpose of this conversation is like, as you say, there's risk with everything, whether it's property, whether it's shares, bonds, collectibles, artwork, gold and silver, and you really have to get down into the nitty-gritty of whatever your money is in to actually understand the full implications of this. And so I think this is a big thing. Purely, one of the big reasons is that because they wanted to keep it so secret for so long. Well, I mean, if they were lending it to the WA government, why don't they just say it? I mean, and why doesn't the Perth Mint just openly say on their website, part of our portfolio is leased gold that does not move? But they haven't made that disclosure. And the fact that they've been opaque on this particular point signifies something about maybe their intent.
Right. And make a more general point, and that is, you can actually look at the same sorts of things going on across interest rate swaps and currency swaps and, all of the other derivatives. And this is the problem, right? So there is a level of opaqueness in the way that a lot of these things are working, right? And the relationship between the underlying, the physical, and all of these other things around the edge are less clear than they should be. Right? And I suspect this is just another example of, financial engineering, or what you want to call it, right? Because, there are some very smart people who think this is a better way to actually go, and et cetera, right? But there are risks below the waterline.
Yes.
And that's the point we're making. There are risks below the waterline that are not clear, are not transparent, and only come out when the tide goes out. In other words, when there's a crisis.
Indeed.
Right?
Yes.
And this is another example of potentially risks that people weren't aware of.
Exactly. So yes, to sum up the conversation, I do have the article about the evidence of our conversation today is on my website. The article about my views on synthetic gold and silver products, which I published a couple of months ago, is on my website. Let's put up my email address if anyone wants to contact me, because to be completely transparent, I mean there are some people who have been owning synthetic product who now want to make a transition to physical gold and silver, and I've been helping some of those people in that process, particularly because of the broader economic environment with central bank money printing and sort of the huge calls on physical gold and silver. And if people want my assistance, happy to help. But the fact remains, there are some additional questions I think the RBA has to answer, as well as the Perth Mint. I mean, the RBA's main one is, how do you know the gold does not move? Why won't you release the audit reports? Why do you continue to put up with audits where the Bank of England dictates what you're allowed to see? And then obviously in terms of the Perth Mint, why haven't you been fully transparent that you have borrowed $1.2 billion worth of gold and silver, including $700 million from the RBA? And if the gold does not move, if it's not to supplement your portfolio, what's the purpose?
Well, big questions. And, let me just say, I'm not in any way endorsing what you do or don't do with your gold advice, right? But this is a really important issue in terms of actually seeing again that what people assume is happening
Yes.
is not what is actually happening.
Correct.
And the danger is in a crisis, people can get caught out. So this is yet another example of read the small print, do the work, right? And get to understand what's really going on.
Yep.
Because then you can protect yourself and your wealth.
Absolutely.
John, appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Martin North, John Adams. Interested people? We'll see you next time.